All right, thank you, Sam. So before we jump into comparing the digital SAT to the ACT, I just want to note that at the time of this recording, we still have a couple paper SAT administrations left before the end of the year, and before that transition over to the digital SAT next March. So for those of you who think you might be taking that test, like Sam said, the digital SAT and the SAT are similar enough in content and scoring that most of the comparisons we're going to do will hold true for both tests. So anything I say here about the digital SAT will effectively be true for the SAT, paper SAT. And if there are any significant differences, I will be sure to mention them. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about DSAT, digital SAT, and ACT differences. So as you can see here, on a high level, these standardized tests have a lot of similarities. Whether you test DSAT or ACT or paper SAT, you'll spend half of your test experience being tested on reading, effective writing, and grammar. And although question types and question presentation do vary somewhat, the rules and the skills tested are also largely the same. So you need the same understanding of grammar rules, ability to discern main points and supporting points, the capacity to connect and transition between ideas, and so on. And all three tests will also test high school math, so especially core content like algebra, geometry, as well as your ability to work with and interpret data in graphs and in charts. Now, if you're paying attention to our graphic here, there's an obvious difference, which is that ACT includes a science section. But calling it a science section is really a bit of a misnomer, and we will talk about that soon. So then, what are the differences that we should care about? Well, the most impactful difference between the digital SAT and the ACT is that the ACT is a much faster paced test. So here are the average times you're given on each test to complete questions. You have 69 seconds on average to answer each question on the digital SAT. And it's 70, by the way, on the paper SAT. You have only 49 seconds on average to complete each question on the ACT. That difference is going to feel huge for a ton of testers, and it can rule out the ACT entirely for some. Now, even if that faster pace doesn't rule the ACT out, it can still be a shock. So I remember proctoring an ACT last year, and one of the girls testing at the end of the test passed me a bubble sheet with half of the English questions missing. There are 75 of them. So we're talking the last 30 or some questions that she left completely blank. Not amazing for your score, I'm sure you can imagine. But I noticed that her other sections were completely fine, including the two fastest paced sections, reading and science. So I was curious, and I asked her what happened. Her answer was, I just had no idea it was going to move that fast. Not a big deal. She adjusted fine, and I expect would move much more quickly taking it a second time, but obviously not a surprise you want on test day. But don't let this scare you off of the test, because this difference has a significant implication. The ACT adjusts for this faster pace by making its questions a bit more straightforward. So let's dig in a bit and see how that shows up, starting with reading and writing. The now combined reading and writing sections of the digital SAT heavily emphasize close, careful reading and, say, nuanced comprehension. Now, this is true even when the DSAT tests grammar. The focus is much more on how ideas connect than we'll see on the ACT. On the ACT, reading questions are much more focused on making sure you're tracking the facts of the passage correctly. And in English, much of the test has you just using correct punctuation, verb form, pronouns, apostrophes, etc. Now, there are certainly some deeper questions, but the majority will be more straightforward than on the SATs. And this makes sense because you have much less time per question to dive deeply into questions on the ACT. So let me show you an example. So if you read this question, it says, according to the passage, the Washington Monument was capped with a pyramid of aluminum because. I have no idea. But all you'll need to answer this question correctly is to know where in the passage this information shows up. Compare that to the question on the next slide. So now we have a poem. We see men's lives will have fresh seeing, gray lives reprise their span. I won't read the rest, but you get the idea. And when we're asked to identify the main purpose of the text, we have choices like choice A here, to consider how the repetitiveness inherent in human life can both be rewarding and challenging. So to be clear, there are harder ACT questions than the one we showed you and easier SAT ones than this, but this really does capture the core difference. with the faster paced ACT, the pressure on you to closely read and deeply comprehend is just less, like across the board, less. And this trade-off, because of the faster pacing of the ACT, shows up in math as well. So math on the SAT, digital SAT, requires more strategy. And you'll have a variety of ways you can approach different problems. So it's up to you to choose the best approach. Maybe graphing, plugging in values, testing outcomes, or possibly straight algebra. And some approaches will cause you to waste time or fall into common traps. What approaches tend to lead to the most errors or trap answers are often the ones you've learned in school. I mean, I can't tell you how many kids I've worked with who look at these questions and tell me, oh yeah, I know that, I've got that, and then are baffled when they get a third of them wrong. So expect a learning curve, even for those who are really, really strong academically in math. Now, ACT math problems are often challenging, but they can also often be solved using most of the same methods students have learned in school. And missing questions will also actually cost you fewer points on the ACT than SAT, so mistakes are less costly. Now, there's some other differences unrelated to timing worth mentioning. So it's important to know that ACT math questions cover much more ground. You'll see more early math, like pre-algebra, and more later math, like some basic pre-calc. And also worth mentioning, while you can use a calculator throughout both the digital SAT and the ACT, I should just mention that there is a no calc section on the paper SAT for any of you who might still take it. But the most impactful difference is this. SAT math makes up 50% of your total score on the digital SAT, and for what it's worth on the paper SAT. That's a ton. So great if you're good at math, and in particular, the way math presents on the SAT, but it does mean it's probably going to take more work to overcome a weaker math score on either the SATs than the ACT. So what's the message, or why am I showing you this? It's that when we think about test selection, we should recognize that on the ACT, there's a wider variety of math questions and somewhat tighter time constraint, but also recognize that missing questions will cost you less in the ACT math section, and your ACT math score will impact your overall ACT score less than your digital SAT math impacts your digital SAT score. All right, finally to science. We didn't forget, that's the last big distinction between tests. So most importantly, this isn't really testing science. I had a mom really concerned about this because her son had taken his physics class with a teacher that, as he put it, sucked. And so naturally he came out feeling like he didn't really have a good grasp on the content. And that was scaring, mom, that was scaring him off of the ACT. And that's totally reasonable. Science is right there in the name. So you would think that the questions are science-based, and you'd be basically wrong. So while you need a few basic facts, this is overwhelmingly a test of managing information. So that includes locating information, on tables, graphs, charts. It includes interpreting trends or extrapolating from them, and it includes drawing inferences from like one or multiple data sets. But science really just provides the context. So take a look at this question. We have a good example for you here. This question has an obvious science context, with our scientific names like C. sapidus, C. marina. But the question is really just asking us to look at this table and recognize that as the Z. marina population density increases, so does the number of surviving C. sapidus. And seeing that trend requires no science knowledge whatsoever. Also, for what it's worth, this sort of data interpretation is spread throughout the digital and paper SATs. They've just integrated the data interpretation into their reading and writing passages and some of the math questions. What do we make of this? All right, takeaways. Here are the basic ones. The ACT is faster paced than the digital or paper SAT. Again, prohibitively so for some students. This is super important. The ACT reading focuses on finding information under pressure. Digital SAT reading and SAT reading will give you more time, but require deeper comprehension. Your digital SAT score is heavily influenced by its two math sections, and the more limited math means being very good in these key content areas. And the ACT has a science section, although it doesn't really test science. This may give you a good sense already of which test your child is best suited for, but you can actually come out pretty surprised. when you actually have your child take both tests and compare. So the only way to truly know is to go through that process, take a practice test of each and see what the experience is like. And this leads us to our last important comparison. How are you supposed to compare scores in these tests? So here we have the basics in front of us. Digital SAT and paper SAT are scored at a 1600. As Sam mentioned earlier, the scoring works the same way, and they can correlate really well. So anything we say here applies to both tests. To calculate your total score at a 1600, the SAT just adds up your two major section scores. You have your reading and writing, formerly ERW, and math. And both of those are out of 800. ACT is out of 36, and this is an average of those 4 sections we saw earlier, each also out of 36. You can compare across tests with concordance tables, like the one right here, and this is pulled together with pretty recent, I think 21, 22 data. So what this tells us is that a 25 on the ACT is roughly a 1240 on the SAT. So at this point, we have a fun question for all of you to think about. You won't have a chance to respond, but think about it for a second before we move on. And the question is, are these tests curved? We asked this question because we've heard many, many answers to this over the years, and also many interpretations of what that means. So if you've thought about it, gotten an answer generated in your head, let's talk a little bit and answer the question for you. Okay, this tends to produce a pretty wide spread of answers. So I can guarantee whatever answer you had, many people had before you. And I think that's because of how we use the term curved. Let me dig into that a bit. Are these tests curved? Well, first of all, we have to know that these tests are scaled, right? This is how we end up with scores like 36, 15, 40, whatever. So the SAT, DSAT, and ACT all take the number of questions you answered correctly and convert that into a scaled score for each section. Again, the 1 out of 36 or the 1 out of, in terms of the SAT sections, 800. And for what it's worth, no penalty on any of these tests for wrong answers. So then the number of questions you need to get right for a certain scaled score varies from test to test. And this is where the idea of a curve test comes from. So, 60 questions right on one test may not get you the same score as 60 questions right on another test. Okay, so there is this difference, but what is a curve specifically? Usually when we think of a curve, we think of a student taking a test in class and having those test results adjusted to the performance of other students who took that same test. This does not happen on these tests. The SAT and ACT results are not impacted at all by the performance of other testers on that day. And it really doesn't matter if that's like a school day test or a Saturday test, fall, spring, summer. So no curve in that sense. But for consistency across tests, yes, the SAT will make adjustments for test sections that have slight variations in difficulty. And as we have up on the slide here, easier tests are graded more harshly and hard tests are graded more easily. This is called equating, not technically a curve, and this is what accounts for the different scales on different tests. So it's meant to keep things pretty fair so that a kid who gets lucky with a slightly easier section doesn't end up with a better score, but these different scales can still impact students. So it's a very good reason to test more than once. And last quick comment, I'll add that the digital SAT scoring system is a bit more sophisticated than the previous SAT or the ACT scoring systems. But the key points to keep in mind are still, 1, no one test date should provide an advantage over any other. But 2, your scores will look different on different tests, even if you tested all on the same day and got the same number of right answers.